Welcome back. 365 Sports. Colby Newton is about to join us. We've got a couple Big 12 topics coming up later on in the show as well. But we're going to dive into the SEC right now with author Colby Newton. His book, SEC Football, How a Regional League Became a National Obsession, comes out on July 16th. Available for pre-order at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, as well as most independent bookstores. Colby, the SEC... and we were just talking about right before you came on about how they, in many people's opinions, muscled Florida State out of the playoff this year, and due in large part to the fact that they figured out years ago that the marketing machine, if it just means more and all those things, really does work. And, even in years where they're a little bit down, they can kind of mask it because of the history and all that. What did you find in your research about how they became what they are now? Because just 20 years ago or 25 years ago, they were pretty much just like everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And that's a great question to kick it off with. When I looked at kind of the genesis of what I wanted to study and research and put together was from 1961 to 1990, the SEC won 6 national titles in football. And from 1990 to last year, that number tripled, and it really started to pick up pace in the early 2000s. And like you said, they were pretty much like every other league up until that point. And we spend the bulk of the book looking at what happened. And a lot of things happened in the 80s and 90s that was able to put the SEC on this almost pedestal ahead of so many other leagues. And it was really fascinating to dive back into it, especially with the backdrop of what's going on right now with college football, whether it's more expansion, it's the playoff, it's scheduling, all those different things that have come together that are currently going on in college football.
Colby, you've got a history, obviously, writing and covering college football. See the helmets behind you. Those look great. But where did this idea originally stem from? I mean, obviously, we all love college football, but to say, like, hey, I'm going to focus on this particular idea and go forward with it, how did all that start?
It actually started with a real simple thing, the SEC on CBS. I'm from the West, and that was an initial idea that CBS had to put SEC football nationally. And as I was growing up as a teenager in the early 90s, for us here in the Mountain Time Zone, 1:30 was when the SEC was on every single week. And it changed the paradigm, I think, of college football. And that's really where they were able to start to build this marketing machine that you're talking about, where it just means more, and get that pageantry out to the entire country. And that was ending. So that ended last year. CBS no longer will carry the SEC going forward. This year is the first year of some of the new arrangements. And so I just thought, that's interesting to me. Let me look into that a little bit more and see, did it really have the kind of impact nationally that it did on me personally? And it did. It was a huge part of propelling the SEC forward in the national consciousness.
Colby, what did you find when it came to like those actual decisions? Like, when was it, like you said CBS, but who was like the ones who came up with let's really push that it does just mean more, and that we can show that people care way more in Tuscaloosa and in Gainesville and in Athens than they do in Los Angeles?
Yeah, I think really you got to start with Roy Kramer. He was the visionary behind a lot of this, and it was actually, I think, 3 bigger things that happened. The conference expansion in the late 80s, where they grabbed South Carolina and Arkansas, were huge. Something that I think a lot of people forget is Arkansas was the very first team in probably 50 years to leave one power league at the time and go to another. South Carolina was an independent. Penn State joined the Big Ten from independent. So they weren't really leaving anything as much as joining a group. When Arkansas left, that was the first domino that fell. The next thing that Kramer did was he came up with the SEC championship game, which a lot of people thought was a crazy idea. It was fun to go back and read some of the articles and quotes at the time. Other coaches were furious at the SEC. They threatened to not schedule the SEC anymore because they were doing this. And so there was a lot of pushback, and Kramer didn't care. He just kept moving forward. And the third thing that happened was that SEC on CBS contract that really started to push forward the pageantry. A fun quote that I found in my research is ABC at that time in the mid 90s was regionalizing college football. So if you're living in the middle of Texas, you're going to see a Southwest Conference game every Saturday afternoon. At the same time, the West is seeing the Pac-10 and so on. Well, when this SEC and CBS got together, an executive at ABC at the time said, this will never work. Somebody in Colorado will never care about what's going on between Tennessee and Ole Miss. And you look back on that now, and it's that was the beginning of everybody caring about the SEC. You might love the conference, you might despise the conference, but most college football fans care one way or the other about the SEC.
Yeah, either you love them or you love to hate them, right? It's
Yes.
basically what it is. I've maintained this, that they always had like a stranglehold over the Southeast. Like that passion was always there. It just wasn't nationalized, like you said. And so kudos to a lot of people that saw the future. But ESPN's obviously had a heavy dose of taking that and taking it even further. But Colby, if they don't win all of these national championships, I'm sure they're still probably out front to some extent, but not nearly the way that they are now. And I know the Big Ten's there as well, but I mean, winning is ultimately why this is what it is as far as a brand, right?
Absolutely. And I think it really, you can go right to the national championships. I know it's just one team and these leagues have so many teams in it now, but you mentioned that 1961 and 1990, they won 6 titles. Like you guys said, they were like everybody else. And now they're just not. And what kind of started to happen was you had Roy Kramer with all these incredible moves that he made that at the time were risky. Looking back in retrospect, we're like, well, yeah, duh, that makes sense. But they were super risky. And the money started to roll in because they signed that contract with CBS. They were already nationally broadcast in the early 80s on TBS. They were the first league to jump out in front with that. And then they had contracts with ESPN where you could see an SEC game all day long, regardless of where you lived. And it just multiplied exponentially on itself. And the money starts to roll in. And now you're able to recruit differently. You're building facilities in a different manner. And everything really kind of changed in that early 2000 time frame. But it was funny. The SEC's always kind of been out in front, I think, because of the passion.
Yeah.
In the early 1930s, schools were concerned about putting the games on radio because they thought it would hurt their gate. The SEC was the first league that said, actually, no, we're going to lean into that. We want every single one of our schools to sign their own deal with radio stations so that we can promote the product. And it just kind of has been, a snowball effect ever since then. You're going on 100 years now.
Colby, are you surprised in seeing this that, like, I know that other leagues have tried to follow suit in one way or the other, but nobody saw that early on when they still, had a competitive balance with them and tried to do the same thing? Because the Big 12 in particular, look, first of all, the Southwest Conference part of it should have known better, since it was, kind of the downfall was started by Arkansas leaving, or at least the downfall was started by other things, but Arkansas leaving was the thing that unplugged the dam. And when they got together, they didn't set things up that way. They slanted it towards Texas and Nebraska and A&M and Oklahoma financially, but didn't really promote themselves the same way that the SEC did. I'm curious as to why that didn't happen and why more teams, when the SEC was having even moderate success with those kind of things, didn't go, oh, let's do this too so we can keep pace.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And it was really interesting to look back and kind of see it through history's lenses to see why were some leagues making decisions differently than what the SEC was doing, because it was working. And the Southwest Conference was a really interesting case study as I looked at Arkansas leaving, and they were frustrated for a couple of years, along with some of the bigger schools in the league, A&M and Texas in particular, where the smaller schools like a Rice was one that came up a lot, that refused to allow some of these bigger programs to take advantage of some of the things that they needed to take advantage of that just hurt the league in the long run. And the Big 12 was the first one to really jump on the championship game bandwagon. Mm-hmm. It was really interesting to look at how long it took some of these other leagues, especially the Big 10. And now going forward, what's going to happen? the SEC has continued to stay regional as they've picked off some of these other leagues. At least it's within a geographic footprint. The Big Ten is just the whole country now. What are we going to look at 10 years from now? Well, one of them made more sense than the other. I don't think anybody knows, but I think we'll understand in 10 years, oh, you should have done it that way.
Yeah, they've always just kind of been on the forefront, have they? They've always had this special foresight to just kind of know when to make the right decisions at the right time. That's just it's obviously worked out beautifully. What was your favorite part of researching or talking to people? Like what really excited you about writing this book?
Yeah, it was really, really fun to write. And I'm a huge history buff, and I love college football, and I love the history of college football. So to dive into some of these anecdotes that I discovered as I talked to people and read old articles, and there were a lot of different stories. A really funny story that jumps out to me is when Arkansas was being courted by the SEC and by Roy Kramer. They had a secret meeting in Memphis, and they met at a little Holiday Inn kind of out of the way. Well, Roy Kramer goes walking into the lobby, and there are TV cameras everywhere. And his first thought is, oh no, this is, everybody knows they're here to try and talk to us. Arkansas is going to say no now because this will scare their board of trustees and they'll stay in the SWC. It was for a beauty pageant. Nobody knew who Roy Kramer was. Nobody talked to him. He still meets with the Arkansas people in the back room, and off they go. And it's like, that would never happen today. And that wasn't that long ago. That was 1988.
Yeah.
So little stories like that were just fascinating to uncover. And the book is full of stuff like that.
They have had, obviously, a run of commissioners that is unparalleled. I mean, Roy Kramer and Mike Slive and now Greg Sankey. And Greg Sankey gives me Putin vibes sometimes with the way he kind of like, oh, well, look, you had your chance. So you kind of dared me, so now I'm doing it this way. Have each of them kind of built off the other and the legacy because they're able to keep their conference in line way more. Like the Big 12 was a disaster. The ACC, maybe not quite as public, but it's kind of similar, especially
the house
now.
is on fire.
Yeah,
right now.
house on fire. The Pac-12 is gone because of hubris, right? And the SEC has never had this problem, and it really starts at the top because they've never really had a bad commissioner.
Yeah, I think it all goes back to Roy Kramer. In the research that I did, I think he set the foundation of how a commissioner should be for a league to look at the greater good as a whole. An example of that is when he proposed the SEC championship game internally to the coaches, they were furious. The SEC is already hard enough. Why are you giving us another game? Gene Stallings, the head coach at Alabama at the time, had the famous quote saying, the SEC will never win another national championship.
He won one.
He won one. And so Roy Kramer had the ability, because he had so much credibility and equity in what his position was, to tell the coaches, trust me, this is going to work. And also, I don't care because I've talked to the presidents. And that was another subtle shift that happened in the 1980s, where the football coaches before that were the ones really calling the shots as it came to bigger picture items. Roy Kramer got the presidents on board. And so if Steve Spurrier and Gene Stallings didn't like what Roy Kramer was doing, he didn't care because he had the buy-in from the presidents. And I think that's where there was a big difference for a league like the Big 12.
Colby, how much does it get into, or how much did you learn about just ESPN? And obviously it coincided with winning national championships. Like all that promotion, it just means more. Wouldn't have meant anything if they were finishing, fifth in the country every year. So it all had to be like a perfect storm together. But it does seem like that combination of winning and then just the platform they seem to be put on promotionally, they've always been on the forefront, as you mentioned, the CBS part of it. But that it just means more, and really hammering that home and driving that home. How calculated was all of that, and how, I guess how much of that also was just perfect timing, the way that it took off the way that it did?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was just a perfect storm with the way that ESPN was rising in the national consciousness about the same time as the SEC was. And they were desperate for programming. You go all the way back to the 1980s with that landmark lawsuit. University of Georgia and University of Oklahoma were out in front on that. And from there, the SEC and the ESPN have just been perfect partners for each other. We talk a lot in the book about the SEC network and that coming forward and just continuing to push the narrative more and more. But like you said, if they don't win, we're not talking about this. And I didn't write a book about it, because the dominance that they had in the league at that time, you can talk about Nick Saban and Urban Meyer. If they don't end up at LSU and at Florida in the early 2000s, maybe that doesn't change it either as well, because now you've got these guys that are recruiting. They've got the money. They've got ESPN. They've got CBS. It just kind of all added up. And you put that on top of the passion that already exists within each fan base, and here we are.
Colby, you also wrote a book about BYU and Utah, and we have a ton of both of those in our viewership. And one thing we found covering the Big 12 once that decision was made was that, I do think like A&M and Texas will pretend like, oh no, we didn't really, but they really did. Like they wanted to. Like they hate each other, but they need each other, kind of a thing. And BYU and Utah, though, are not really that thrilled about being in the same conference. Like where does that like animosity really come from?
Oh wow, that's that goes back decades and decades. And I agree with you. I think especially from Utah's perspective, they were thrilled to kind of finally leave BYU behind and started to use their leverage in ways that they had never been able to do. And then all of a sudden the script is flipped last summer, and had to kind of come back together with BYU. And everyone's fascinated to see how it's going to go going forward, because Utah really has put the pedal to the metal as far as how their program has risen in the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And BYU hasn't been able to match that. But the passion and the fan base, those two fan bases, and the desire to win, at least beat the other, is unmatched across college football and college sports, really.
Colby Newton, the book, SEC Football, How a Regional League Became a National Obsession, out on July 16th. Pre-order Amazon, Barnes & Noble, most independent bookstores. Colby, I can't wait to read it. It sounds fascinating. And thanks for helping on the show. Anytime you write a book or want to talk about anything, you shoot me a text. It's been a great segment.
Hey, I love it. Appreciate you guys having me on, and it was really fun to write. So if you love college football, you're going to love the book.
Absolutely. Thank you, Colby. Good luck.
Thanks, guys.
There you go. So, yeah, I'm very interested to read that. And again, It's like,